The sun was barely up, and the morning air felt different today, almost like it was whispering secrets from a long-lost world. I climbed up the little hill behind my house and sat under my favorite acacia tree. From up here, the horizon always feels endless. Mom says that a long, long time ago, these lands looked very different. Lush forests, rivers full of life, and strange creatures wandering freely. I closed my eyes for a moment, and suddenly my mind drifted back, farther and farther, until the world around me began to change. There were no houses anymore, no roads, no people. Only the rustling of trees and the distant calls of birds echoed in the air. Everything felt wilder. I looked around. Giant oak trees stretched their branches toward the sky, vines hung low, and patches of sunlight flickered through the thick green canopy. It was the Miocene epoch, around 9 million years ago. Somewhere in the branches just above me, I heard a soft rustle. At first, I thought it might be a monkey, but as I watched closely, I realized it wasn't like any monkey I knew. Its limbs were sturdy, and its movement slower, more deliberate, almost thoughtful. Its face was a little like ours, not exactly human, of course, but there was something strangely familiar about it. That was my first glimpse of Ouranopithecus. Yes, I think it was a she, paused and looked toward the dense trees ahead. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes seemed full of curiosity. I watched as she carefully climbed higher, skillfully moving from branch to branch. She didn't swing like gibbons or leap like today's monkeys. Instead, she used her strong hands to steady herself, occasionally using her powerful legs when a branch seemed sturdy enough. She moved with caution, like someone making sure every step counted. Below her, the forest floor was teeming with life. Herds of grazing antelopes wandered near small water holes. A pair of large, shaggy-tusked animals, relatives of modern elephants, trudged along slowly, pulling leaves from low-hanging branches. High up in the sky, a giant bird circled lazily. Everything felt balanced, as if every creature knew its place in this ancient world. But the life of Ouranopithecus wasn't just peaceful exploration. Every day was a quiet struggle between safety and danger, survival and loss. That's why she stayed mostly in the trees. The forest offered protection. A misstep on the ground could mean an unexpected encounter with big predators, hyenas that were much larger than the ones we know today, or saber-toothed cats lurking behind tall grasses. Up here, she could see far and move freely without attracting too much attention. She paused again, sniffing gently at a cluster of ripe figs hanging nearby. Her lips curled with satisfaction as she picked one and put it in her mouth. The way she rolled it around before biting down almost looked like she was carefully tasting it like we do. She reached for another and another. In that moment, it was clear. Food wasn't just fuel. It was a small joy in her daily life, just like it is for us. As the sun rose higher, the light began to pour into the forest, turning the morning haze into golden ribbons. I noticed other members of her group gathering nearby. One of them, a larger male with a broader chest and slightly rougher features, crossed a thick liana and settled on a sturdy branch. A juvenile, light and quick, darted around him, shaking a few leaves down toward the forest floor, almost as if it were playing a game. Their group was small, maybe 6 or 7 individuals. They didn't chatter loudly like modern monkeys, but communicated with soft grunts, gentle eye contact, and carefully timed body movements. Their world depended on trust. If one of them sensed danger, the slightest shift or warning call would send the entire group moving silently to a safer place. It wasn't panic, more like a synchronized dance of survival. By midday, the forest began to buzz with heat. Some of the smaller animals disappeared into shade, and even the streams looked slower, quieter. Ouranopithecus found a resting spot in a thicker part of the canopy. The large male curled an arm around a branch and rested his chin on it, his heavy eyelids closing. The others settled nearby, keeping just enough distance to feel comfortable. It was their version of a peaceful afternoon nap. I took a deep breath as I watched them rest, and the air smelled of damp soil and fresh leaves. For a moment, I almost forgot that I came from another time. Everything here looked complete, like a world that didn't need us to exist. Yet somehow their lives were writing the first pages of a very long story. Our story. As the afternoon passed, one of the juveniles awoke first. He stretched, then began to explore a nearby branch, carefully pulling at the bark with his fingers. He seemed fascinated by a small trail of ants marching in neat rows. He poked the bark gently with his nail, causing the ants to scatter. He tilted his head as if curious about how they organized themselves. It felt strangely familiar, as though curiosity itself was already beginning to appear in these distant relatives of ours. The others slowly stirred, and soon it was time to move again. The group began its gentle, quiet journey through the canopy, staying together like a close family. Suddenly, I heard a loud snapping sound from below, a fallen branch trampled by something heavy. The large male immediately froze, eyes narrowed, and ears alert. The juvenile clung tightly to his mother's side. For a few long seconds, the whole group stayed motionless. Then, emerging from behind a group of thick ferns, a large predator appeared, muscular, silent, and deadly. It wasn't quite like the lions we know today. It had a more elongated body and powerful jaws. It glanced up toward the trees, eyes fixed on the movement above. The male, Ouranopithecus, slowly stepped forward and positioned himself in the line of sight, shielding the others behind him. No one made a sound, but the tension was so strong I could feel my heart pounding. For one terrifying moment, predator and primate stared at one another. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the predator turned its head and trotted away, disappearing into the undergrowth. The group waited in silence until its footsteps faded completely. Only then did they begin to move again, slowly, cautiously, staying closer than before. That evening, the forest changed once again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned soft orange and pink, and the air cooled. The group finally reached a tall fig tree overlooking a wide stream. They settled in for the night, finding sturdy branches to rest upon. The large male sat slightly higher, watching over the others as they curled up and pressed their backs against larger branches for support. I watched them as night fell. A few fireflies began to flicker in the distance, tiny lights dancing in the dark. One little juvenile reached out and tried to catch one, but it slipped away into the night. He looked at his hand for a moment, surprised, then tucked it back under his chin and closed his eyes. As the gentle sounds of insects filled the air, I suddenly felt a soft breeze against my face. And just like that, I was back under my acacia tree. The morning sun of my own time was now bright and warm. I stayed still for a while, thinking about what I had seen. Most people think history starts with cities and kings and battles. But maybe it started much earlier, with beings like Ouranopithecus, quietly exploring their world, caring for their little ones, and surviving day after day. They didn't know it, but they were planting seeds, curiosity, courage, family, that would grow and grow until one day we would look back and call it the beginning of us. The next time I closed my eyes, I didn't sit on the acacia hill. Instead, I lay flat on the cool grass beside the old stream behind our farmhouse. I let the sound of running water guide my thoughts. It trickled and gurgled softly, just like it must have done millions of years ago. And slowly, almost like a gentle pull, the world around me began to shift again. The grass grew taller. Trees began rising in the distance. The air turned heavier, more humid. This wasn't the same place I first arrived in part 1. The forest still stretched wide, but now it looked more open in some areas, Patches of grassland interrupted the great green canopy. The seasons had slightly changed, and so had the landscape. This was still the late Miocene, but time had moved forward. Ouranopithecus was adapting, and so was the world they lived in. Far ahead, I saw a familiar dark shape moving along the midpoint of a huge oak trunk. It was her again. The same Ouranopithecus. Female I saw before, though something about her seemed calmer now, more confident. There was a fruit in her hand, and a young one clinging to her back. His tiny fingers gripped tightly around the thick reddish-brown fur on her shoulders. He peeked curiously over her shoulder at the world beyond the leaves. The rest of the group was slowly moving in the same direction, following a well-known path across the treetops. It wasn't a random journey. They moved with purpose toward a cluster of large fig trees that had ripened earlier than normal. It felt like they had made this trip before, as if they remembered where food would be, even across changing seasons. That tiny detail made me stop and think. We sometimes assume memory is modern, but maybe it isn't. Even back then, these quiet ancestors were learning to remember, to plan, to recognize patterns. Just then, one of the juveniles stopped and crouched low, staring at something on the branch in front of him. I moved closer and saw a colorful beetle making its slow way across the bark. At first, he simply watched, but then he reached out a finger and gently poked it. The beetle flinched and scurried away. The juvenile tilted his head, almost amused, then tried tapping the branch again to see if more would appear. It didn't. But the curiosity remained. Every small movement, every new discovery. It all formed little lessons. By midday, the group arrived at the fig trees. The branches were heavy with fruit. Ouranopithecus wasted no time. The larger male climbed toward the higher branches and began pulling figs down, allowing the others to eat without overloading the fragile ends of the limbs. He picked carefully, using one hand to grasp the branch and the other to remove the fruit. At times, he even looked around before handing a fig to one of the females nearby. It almost looked like sharing, and perhaps it truly was. But food wasn't the only thing drawing them to this part of the forest. Just a short distance away was a wide patch of open ground where sun touched the earth directly. It wasn't totally safe. Open spaces meant fewer escape routes. But it offered something else, new plants, roots, and insects that didn't grow in the shaded areas. In the late afternoon, after the group had eaten enough figs, the female I had first seen carefully climbed down the tree. She tested the ground with her fingers first, like someone checking the temperature of water before stepping in. She moved slowly across the open area, sometimes standing partially upright for a few seconds to look around before crouching back down and moving forward. Her long arms helped balance her weight, and her strong legs supported those short, upright movements. It amazed me. This wasn't full bipedal walking as we know it, but it was a moment, an early experiment in standing up. Maybe long before humans, the dream of walking on two legs began with small upright pauses like this. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the other side of the clearing. Two large bovids, massive creatures with thick horns, were engaged in a fierce territorial clash. Their heads slammed together with a force that shook nearby trees. Ouranopithecus instantly dropped back down and rushed toward the safety of a fallen tree trunk. She pressed her back against it, holding her breath. The young one instinctively hid underneath her arm, staying completely still. Even the male up in the tree froze in place, eyes wide and fixed on the fighting animals. The fight lasted only a few minutes, but to Ouranopithecus every second must have felt like an hour. Finally, the larger bovid chased the other away, and calm gradually returned. The female exhaled slowly and began to move again, now much more cautiously, sticking to the edges of the clearing rather than crossing the middle. She reached down and pulled out a handful of soft tubers from the soil. The young one sniffed them curiously before taking a small bite. A new flavor, a new sensation. It seemed almost like a small reward after the danger. As the sun started to lower, the entire group retreated back toward the forest's deeper shadows. The fig trees were behind them now. Ahead, the branches were thicker, and the canopy formed a natural roof overhead. They moved quickly, as though they wanted to reach a particular spot before dark. I wondered where they were going. And then I saw it. An old, massive tree with a hollowed trunk. Its wood was cracked with age, but its roots were strong and wide. The opening in the trunk was just large enough for an Ouranopithecus to enter, and inside it was surprisingly spacious. One by one they slipped inside. It was not exactly a nest, but it was something like a shelter. The air inside was cooler, and the thick wood provided protection from strong winds and sudden nighttime predators. The young ones cuddled close to their mothers, and the large male positioned himself near the entrance, his eyes directed outward into the darkening forest. Again, there was no loud communication, just small movements and quiet reassurance. Night fell slowly, and the forest changed its voice. Owls began to call from high branches. Insects buzzed in rhythmic patterns. Somewhere in the distance, a river flowed steadily. Even in this ancient world, night had its own music. Sitting in the shadows of that ancient tree, I realized how difficult their lives truly were, and how incredible it was that they survived at all. They didn't have tools yet. They didn't have fire. They didn't speak in words. But they had instincts, memory, bravery, and care for one another. And sometimes, those simple things were enough. As I watched them settle in for the night, something inside me felt different. I used to think evolution was cold and scientific, just bones and stones and timelines. But in that moment, it felt like something warmer, a quiet story of families holding together, generation after generation, adapting to whatever the world offered. The young juvenile curled into a ball and drifted off to sleep, one hand still resting on his mother's shoulder. The large male's eyes slowly began to close too, though he kept himself propped up, as if unwilling to completely let his guard down. Outside, fireflies drifted lazily through the darkness again, just like before. I watched them rise and fall, through the air like little stars. Then another gentle breeze touched my cheek. I opened my eyes, and I was back beside the modern stream behind my house. The water made the same gentle sound. The sky above me was full of evening stars now, and the cool night air felt familiar and safe. I sat up slowly and looked back toward the house lights shining in the distance. Somewhere deep in my heart, I could still feel the slow heartbeat of that Miocene world, the cautious footsteps on tree branches, the quiet moments of curiosity, the soft bonds of family. They were not just fossils or ancient names in textbooks. They were living beings. They mattered. And in some quiet way, they still do. Because without them, we would not be here. I didn't plan on traveling back that night. In fact, I had gone to bed early, thinking I should give my imagination a little rest after everything I had already seen. But something strange happened. While I was asleep, I heard the distant call of a bird. Soft at first, almost like it came from a dream. It wasn't a sound I recognized from my backyard or any place I had ever visited. It sounded ancient. When I opened my eyes, my room was gone. I was standing in the middle of a wide, open forest clearing, surrounded by tall trees whose tops disappeared far into the misty morning sky. The ground was still wet with dew and thin strands of fog curled between the roots like lazy snakes. My heart beat a little faster, but not out of fear. It felt like the world was welcoming me back. Somewhere above me, leaves rustled gently. I tilted my head upward and immediately spotted them. My old friends, the small group of Ouranopithecus, perched high in the canopy, still waking from their sleep. The large male sat slightly apart from the others, stretching his muscular arms and shaking bits of moss off his fur. The juvenile was curled up against his mother's side, half asleep, sucking softly on one of his fingers the way a human child might. The forest around them looked different today. The air seemed heavier, more humid, and I noticed that many of the tall trees in this area were dying. Their bark was cracked and peeling, and patches of fungus grew along their branches. It wasn't a sudden disaster. It looked slow, gradual, like the forest was quietly changing into something else, and that meant the animals living here would have to change too. The group descended from the hollowed tree they had used as shelter the night before. This time, they didn't head straight toward the fig trees. Instead, they moved cautiously into a part of the forest I hadn't seen before. The male led the way, checking each branch carefully before allowing the others to follow. The female with the juvenile kept glancing down toward the forest floor, as if she was searching for something. After a while, they stopped near a line of large shrubs dotted with small yellow fruit. I watched closely as the female pulled one of the berries and sniffed it. She hesitated. The juvenile leaned forward, clearly eager, but she gently pushed his hand away. Instead of eating the berry, she pressed it between her fingers, watching as the pulp dripped out. Then she sniffed, her fingers again. Only after that did she finally taste it. It wasn't just hunger, it was caution. The forest was changing, and new plants meant new risks. Some berries could be safe, others could be poisonous. It reminded me of the way my mom always checks labels at the store before buying anything. The more I watched them, the more human. They seemed, not in the way they looked, but in the way they behaved. As they continued their journey, we reached the edge of the forest, and that's where I saw it. A vast stretch of grassland, rolling gently into the distance like a green ocean. A few scattered trees stood here and there, and far across the plain I could see herds of large animals grazing peacefully. It felt like standing at the border of two worlds. Behind us, the shaded, tangled forest. Ahead of us, the bright, open savanna. The group stopped at the very edge. They didn't step into the grassland. They just looked. The male raised his head, his nose twitching as he caught the wind. The young juvenile peeked through the leaves, eyes wide with curiosity. For them, this space was unfamiliar and risky. There were no branches to climb here, no safe places to escape if danger came running. But at the same time, the grassland was full of possibilities. More food, more space, new sources of water. I could almost feel the internal conflict inside them. Stay where it's safe, but slowly dying, or move into something unknown and full of opportunity. It was a choice that would eventually change the course of evolution. Suddenly, a distant stampede broke the silence. A group of antelope-like mammals rushed across the plain, chased by a pair of large, dog-like predators. The ground shook slightly under their thundering feet, and dust rose into the air. The Ouranopithecus instantly retreated several steps back into the forest, eyes alert and muscles tense. The juvenile clung tightly to his mother, burying his face in her fur. When the danger passed, they hesitated at the edge again. But this time, they didn't turn back completely. They stayed, quietly watching the grassland settle again, as if trying to learn its rhythm before stepping forward. The day grew hotter. The sun climbed high in the sky, shining brightly over the grassy plains and casting long shadows through the forest's edge. The group decided to rest in the shade of a large tree with wide, low branches. The juvenile took the opportunity to climb a little higher, exploring every knot and crevice in the bark. At one point, he discovered a small patch of sticky sap oozing from the trunk. He touched it, then pulled his hand back quickly, shaking, his fingers as if surprised by how thick and sticky it was. A few moments later, he touched it again, this time more carefully, and brought his fingers to his lips. His face lit up. The sap was sweet. He called softly to the others, and the female climbed up to his branch. She examined the sap carefully, then gathered a small bit by scraping it with her fingernails, offering it to the larger male. He sniffed first, then licked it experimentally. His eyes narrowed with approval, and soon they were all taking turns gathering small amounts of the sticky sweetness. It wasn't just food, it was discovery, shared discovery. It made me realize that survival wasn't only about fighting off danger. It was also about learning together. Even tiny experiments like tasting sap or testing berries could become valuable lessons passed down through the group. Later that afternoon, as the air began to cool again, the group slowly approached the grassland's edge once more. This time, the female took a step forward, just 1 foot onto the open ground. She stood there for a few seconds, listening, watching. Then she stepped back. It was such a small moment. 1 step. But it felt like something important had happened, like the very first whisper of a new future. The large male let out a quiet grunt and led the group away from the edge for now. They still returned to the safety of the forest as night approached. But I had seen the spark of change. I knew they would come back. The sun slowly dipped behind the distant hills, turning the sky into a soft blend of orange and pink. The group climbed into another thick old tree, finding comfortable branches to rest on. The juvenile was the last to lie down. He kept looking back toward the grassland, as though he was still thinking about it even as he yawned and curled up beside his mother. When the forest finally grew dark, I felt that familiar breeze again. The ancient world softened and dissolved. And a moment later, I was back in my own bed, staring at the ceiling. My heart was still beating fast, not from fear, but from awe. I realized that history wasn't just about what already happened. Sometimes, it was also about the choices that almost happened, the moments when someone took 1 small step toward something new, and deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of their next chapter, and ours. The sun over the ancient landscape felt very different from the one I see today. It wasn't brighter or hotter, it just seemed somehow new, as if the world itself was still discovering what it meant to be alive. I still remember the day. My teacher first told us about an ancestor few people talk about. Not Neanderthals, not Homo habilis, or even Australopithecus. Something much older. Something mysterious. His name was Ouranopithecus, and even though he lived more than 9 million years ago, the quiet footprints he left behind would eventually lead to us. My teacher paused before writing the name on the dusty chalkboard. Most people believe the earliest steps toward humankind happened in Africa, he said in a low voice. But what if I told you the trail begins somewhere else too? Somewhere else, like northern Greece and Macedonia, where the air once flickered with warm wind and strange calls echoed from the trees. Nobody knows what Ouranopithecus looked like exactly, but scientists do know he wasn't like a modern monkey. Imagine a stocky ape, bigger than a chimp, moving through the forest with a deep chest and strong jaw. Not goofy or clumsy, but calm, intentional, and curious. Like he understood he was part of something bigger, something still unfolding. At that time, Europe wasn't what it is today. Instead of olive groves and quiet coastal roads, the land was a mosaic of forests, open woodlands, and grassy plains. Tall trees made colorful canopies, and below them lay tangled undergrowth rich, with sweet fruit and crunchy seeds. Rivers sliced through the land like bright ribbons. But this vibrant landscape was also changing. The Miocene epoch was coming to an end, bringing unpredictable shifts in climate. Rainfall patterns broke down, parts of the forest dried up, and the apes that had once flourished across Europe began to disappear. All of them, except one. Ouranopithecus managed to survive where others could not. The secret? He learned how to adapt. Unlike his cousins, who depended on fruit alone, Ouranopithecus had a powerful jaw and large molars, perfect for cracking tough nuts and fibrous roots. That might sound like a small detail, but in a world where fruit became scarce, it made all the difference. While other apes slowly starved, Ouranopithecus explored new food sources, experimenting with what the land offered. Sometimes I imagine him sitting at the base of a tree, holding a tough nut in his dark hand, pressing it between his molars and cracking it open with a satisfying snap. Maybe he enjoyed the bitter flavor. Maybe he didn't. But survival wasn't always about enjoyment. It was about persistence, and he was good at it. Scientists have found fossils of his teeth and jaws near places like Ravin de la Pluie in Greece. The teeth are worn in a way that proves he ate harder food than other apes of his time. It's funny how something so small, just a tooth, can tell such a big part of a story. But that's how paleontologists piece together the past, one fragment at a time. Still, the challenges didn't stop with drought and food shortage. Competition was everywhere. Wild pigs snorted as they searched for roots. Hyenas patrolled the edges of the woodland, alert to the scent of weakening prey. Saber-toothed cats, swift and silent, watched for any creature that paused too long. But there was something interesting about Ouranopithecus. He probably spent more time on the ground than earlier apes. Not entirely, of course. Trees were still a safe place to sleep and hide. But stepping onto the ground meant greater mobility. It meant he could roam farther, search wider, and maybe even explore open savannas when the forests became too thin. It must have felt risky. Every step away from the safety of the branches was a step into the unknown. Sometimes I picture a young Ouranopithecus, a little awkward but brave, climbing down from a massive oak tree right after sunrise. The forest around him is silent. Dew glitters on the grass. He pauses, sniffs the air, and then starts walking into the tall grass that leads beyond the familiar shadows. Maybe he's looking for food. Maybe he's just curious. But with each step, he unknowingly prepares the future for beings like us. That's the beautiful irony. He had no idea what he was starting. Movement created opportunity, and opportunities changed behavior. By spending more time on the ground, Ouranopithecus would have needed better observation skills, scanning the horizon, reading subtle movements, noticing patterns. Was that rustle in the grass just a lizard or something bigger? These small decisions created tiny cognitive advances that, over long periods of time, could have shaped the earliest beginnings of higher thinking. In a way, he wasn't just surviving. He was experimenting with the world. Back then, Europe and Africa were separated by a shallow sea called the Tethys, but land bridges sometimes formed when water levels dropped. These momentary connections might have allowed Ouranopithecus, or his descendants, to migrate south into the African continent where our lineage would eventually flourish. Some scientists believe Ouranopithecus might be the last common ancestor of humans and African great apes. Others argue he represents an early European branch that later went extinct. The truth may lie somewhere between those views, but one thing is certain. He represents a turning point where an ancient ape left the comfort of the trees, tasted bitter roots, and decided not to give up, even when everything around him was falling apart. It's strange how powerful that is. These weren't heroic decisions made with a grand vision. These were small choices: what to eat, where to walk, when to explore. Yet those choices set the stage for millions of years of evolution. As a boy trying to understand my place in history, I sometimes sit in the backyard and stare at the trees. I imagine what it must feel like to leap between branches, feeling the bark against my hands. Then I imagine stepping down to the ground for the first time, exposed and uncertain. Ouranopithecus didn't know he was starting a journey, but he did. The wind blew softly across the open woodland, carrying the scent of dried leaves and distant rivers. It was the kind of wind that made the tall grass sway like an ocean. Somewhere in the middle of that golden sea, the young Ouranopithecus paused and looked back toward the forest he had just left behind. He could still hear it, the rustling of branches, the low calls of birds nesting high above, the familiar whispers of home. But something had changed. Maybe it was the shrinking shadows of the trees or the taste of dust in the air. Or maybe it was something deeper, a feeling, almost like a quiet push telling him that staying in the same place would no longer keep him safe. Ahead of him stretched a patchwork of new territories, open woodlands, rocky slopes, and scattered groves of trees that offered both promise and danger. The forest canopy behind him was thinning each year, the fruit drops becoming more and more unpredictable. Waiting was no longer an option, so instinctively, he kept walking. At first, his steps were cautious. Each time a twig snapped under his foot, a jolt of panic shot through his chest. He would freeze, listening closely, for the growl of a predator, for the sudden flap of wings, for anything out of the ordinary. But the grass only moved with the wind, as if welcoming him onward. His group, small and tightly bonded, followed, at a careful distance. They were not explorers by choice. They were explorers by necessity. Sometimes in the evenings, they still climbed trees to rest, choosing thick branches high above the ground. The trees in these new territories were more spread out and less familiar. They didn't feel like safe shelters. They felt like temporary stations in a much longer journey. But during the day, the ground became their path. This new routine demanded new behaviors. In the branches, balance was everything: strong hands, flexible feet, and an instinctive sense of movement among the limbs. On the ground, however, something different was needed: awareness. It was no longer enough to simply look ahead. Now the young Ouranopithecus had to scan the distance, observe the patterns of light and shadow, and listen to the subtle changes in the wind. There was a time long ago when all European apes were forest dwellers. They thrived in humid canopies, rich with fruit and leaves. But as climate change began to reshape the continent, most of those apes vanished. Only the most adaptable ones remained. This adaptability didn't just affect their diet, it also influenced their social behavior. Ouranopithecus groups were likely small, perhaps 4 to 8 individuals, a mix of adults and juveniles, always moving together, relying on each other for protection. One of the older females often took the lead, having learned through experience how to identify safe paths and where the last hidden waterholes lay. Her ears twitched every few seconds, catching even the faintest sounds of approaching danger. During dry seasons, their bond became even stronger. The young Ouranopithecus often stayed close to her, watching how she tested unfamiliar plants before eating them, how she stood motionless when the wind suddenly stopped, how she retreated into the trees long before the scent of a predator arrived. And like all young ones do, he learned, not through language, but through observation, repetition, and imitation. This is where something remarkable began to form: early cultural memory, not in the modern sense of stories or rituals, but in the way certain behaviors were quietly passed from one generation to the next. Which plants could be eaten safely? Which trees provided the sturdier branches? Which rocky outcrops offered better views of the landscape? Every decision held consequences, and every consequence became a lesson. It may seem small, but in the vast timescale of evolution, these tiny lessons formed the early building blocks of complex intelligence. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in golden light, the young Ouranopithecus climbed a short rise and peered across a shallow valley. What he saw must have made his chest tighten. Beyond the valley lay a stretch of open land unlike anything he had seen before. No tall trees, no dense shrubs, just rolling grasses and a few scattered bushes. Out in the distance, a herd of antelope-like animals moved slowly, their heads grazing, tails flicking at flies. They were beautiful, but they also meant something else. Where herbivores fed freely, predators were never far away. The group gathered beneath the cover of a lone acacia tree, the older female scanning the horizon. They could easily turn back, return to the thinning forest, and take their chances there. But something in her posture suggested a different decision. She stepped forward, toward the open land, turning her head slightly as if signaling the others. One by one, the group followed. Crossing that valley must have been terrifying. Every rustle in the grass could have been a hunting cat. Every bird taking flight could have warned of approaching danger. But as the sun began to sink completely, painting the sky with orange and pink, they finally reached another cluster of trees on the far side. There, beneath the safety of thick branches, they rested. And although they were tired, they were also surrounded by something they hadn't felt in a long time: abundance. The bushes were heavy with late-season berries, and the nearby stream still held cool, drinkable water. That night, as they curled together in the branches, the young Ouranopithecus fell asleep, listening to the soft flow of the stream and the distant calls of nighttime birds. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. He felt something else, something we humans might recognize as hope. Of course, hope alone doesn't guarantee survival. The following months would still bring many challenges, unexpected storms, more fierce predators, and shifts in the ecosystem. But the important thing was this: they kept moving. Each new territory they explored forced them to adapt, observe, and adjust. Their molars continued to wear down, not only from nuts and roots, but from tough grasses and hard seeds found in the savannas. Their limbs slowly strengthened for longer distances. Their senses sharpened to detect threats earlier. And somewhere, along the way, deep in the fabric of their behavior, a spark began to glow: curiosity. Not simple instinct, but a deeper kind of questioning. What lies beyond that riverbank? What might grow on the other side of that hill? Could there be fruit-bearing trees just a little farther west? Curiosity is not accidental. It appears when survival depends not just on reacting, but on exploring. For Ouranopithecus, the world was no longer a fixed space. It was a map of possibilities, and perhaps without even realizing it, that brave young ape took the first steps toward what would one day become the human spirit of discovery.